All right, so we will go ahead and get started. Thanks for responding to that poll. Um, and thanks for joining us for post-flood responsibilities. So Caitlin's gonna, keep the recording on, and then she'll also try to keep people on mute just to cut down on background noise. But yeah, today we're gonna go over basically disaster response as far as floodplain responsibilities. Did that change? Okay, there we go. Um, so post-flood responsibilities really should begin before the flood. And so we are going to talk about flood specific things, but a lot of this is applicable to other types of disasters as well. And so just having a plan in place before something happens will really help you get through a disaster, especially if it's, wide scale and you have a lot of damage that has to be assessed. Um, so just having a plan put together. So this is an example of some FEMA publications that you can order for free. And so having like these publications to put up door hangers and help people to start recovering the right way as soon as possible is really helpful to making sure that you are getting through things quickly enough, because disaster response really has an expedited timeline because people have to make insurance claims. They might need to make ICC claims, and we'll go over that. And you want to make sure that people are getting permits to repair their structures before, they start working, and people want to get back to normal as soon as possible. So, um, depending on the size of the disaster, we might get involved. So basically, once the city has been overwhelmed, or if there's a need for help, then we get involved. And then if we're overwhelmed, then FEMA might get involved, just depending on what they're able to do, if it's a declared disaster or not. So it could be that we are stretched pretty thin if we're helping a lot of communities all at once. And so just being ready to go as much as possible. So ordering these materials ahead of time, knowing where your floodplain properties are, having a database put together of those properties that might need to be assessed. You can't always get what you need from FEMA. And if there's a huge flood like this, some of those publications might be backlogged and you can't get to them. So blue sky days are best for doing preparation for a disaster, just in case. So part of that plan, in addition to having materials ready for property owners, you can have an evacuation plan and then a disaster supply kit. So we could recommend having two supply kits, one for at home and then one for the office. So you might be experiencing the flood yourself with your own home. And so making sure you have an evacuation plan and you're able to, as much as possible, maintain the continuity of operations will be pretty integral to making sure that your recovery is done well. Having a flood insurance policy if you're in the floodplain, flood protection on your structure as much as possible. Training like you're doing now, that's a good first step. Um, Having the substantial damage estimator software, and so that's where I was kind of referencing having a database of those properties. And so we'll go over that a little bit today, but next month I will be doing another 1 hour class just focused on the SDE software and doing assessments and making those determinations for substantial damage. Having form letters, so we do have like a post-disaster kit that has a bunch of form letters in there for different situations, and they're ready to go to property owners to notify them of your determination on their assessment and how they were damaged and those kinds of things. So you can definitely get those from me, or we do have them on the website. Again, having those printed materials, you could have blank floodplain development permits and repairing from a flood, and maybe just a note saying that you'll be doing assessments and that permits are required for repair. So just having like a packet like that ready to go. A contact list and maybe a flood map would be helpful. Again, knowing where your floodplains are and how many structures you have in there. And then doing outreach. So you can put publications around your community, like in a library or the post office and things like that. You can do outreach stuff like this. We do have a like flood simulator table, so we try to go to like more youth events to start teaching kids about flooding. So this was a poster contest that we did, a number of years ago. But if you're doing that outreach, it should be helpful. And we always talk about doing outreach to your property owners that are in the floodplain annually, just reminding them that they need permits and any other pertinent information that they would need to know about being in the floodplain, which might include, damage to their structure would have to be assessed and that stuff. So just making sure people are aware as much as possible. Like there's a turnaround, don't drown campaign. And there's lots of materials and opportunities out there that have already been put together, but you just have to, do the actual outreach. Um, okay. Oh, as I mentioned, yeah, Turnaround Don't Drown is a campaign that they have to warn people about not driving into floodwaters. And so if you're able to get some of that signage or messaging out there, that would be good for your community because I think most flood-related deaths are from people getting trapped in their vehicles after they try to drive into floodwater. And then, the first responders have to put themselves in danger to rescue people doing water rescues. So we want to think about them and avoid those issues as much as possible. So safety first. As soon as possible, you want to get out there and start doing these assessments, but there is some organizing to do first, and you want to go out only after it's safe to do so. Um, the post-flood environment is not necessarily safe. There can be downed power lines. Again, flood water everywhere that can have materials or debris in it. There can be broken gas lines. And so those are things to be aware of as you move through the community in the post-disaster environment. So there can be mice and snakes that go into people's houses. Foundations may have come loose, mud and other slick hazards. So yeah, you downed utilities again. So just making sure that it's safe to do so and making sure that you're vigilant about how you move through that environment. This is a website that we have that doesn't get used very much, but I still try to put it out there, the Kansas Observed Flooding Reporting Tool. And so basically it's like a map that you can go to. I think you do need an ArcGIS Online account, but you can go there and add some information and attach photos from any flooding that you see. And then we maintain that information because it helps us with future mapping and, you know, gauging the accuracy of the mapping. Um, so yeah, we do still like to collect high water lines when possible. And so I still try to encourage this, but it doesn't get used. So, once you're starting to get organized, the first thing to do is determine what the scope of your disaster is. So in this case, flooding. But you want to overlay what that area is with the special flood hazard area. And so this is a city-produced map from their GIS department. And this was a flash flood that happened back in 2011. And so we want to determine the scope and how many of those structures overlay with the floodplain that would need to be assessed because all of them need to be assessed even if they appear to only have minor damage. Damage can be hidden, and so we need a thorough assessment of those structures. And they still need a determination letter from you. Here's another example. So this is Eureka from their 2016 tornado. So we have the tornado path here. and then the green dots are the buildings that are in the floodplain. So we don't have to do assessments on any of them that are outside of the floodplain, and so that's why it helps give you a boost in time if you already have these locations located on a map and in an SDE database, which is free software from FEMA that you can use that helps you organize and generate reports on substantial damage assessments. So again, we'll go over that next month if you're available. You can register for that on our website, but having this ready to go, once you are able to determine the scope of the disaster, you can do this overlay and determine which structures need to be assessed. So this is what happens when we find out about a disaster that has happened with you. So we get notified that something has happened. KDEM gets it with us pretty much first thing to send us their reports. We also monitor the media when we're expecting weather, or you can always, and you should reach out to us right away so that we can help, assist you with whatever you need, which could include, data gathering and helping you do the assessments, but any other assistance that you might need. And just like you, the first thing we need to do is establish that scope, and compare that to your capacity. So are you going to be able to do all of these on your own in a timely manner, or do you need our help? Or are we going to seek a declaration and potentially bring in FEMA? Um, so we have an initial contact with you and we establish that scope, and then we coordinate with KDEM and FEMA. So KDEM responds immediately to emergencies. Obviously, they are our emergency management department. And we will at least be working with FEMA on our side just to keep them informed and stay in communication on any needed assistance from them. We are available to take questions from the community regarding, assessments or permitting or whatever questions they might have about flood insurance, etc. It's possible we may end up doing an open records request for permits at some point, but usually we're able to coordinate pretty well with the floodplain administrator to get those documents for the assessment that we do on the community's recovery. So again, permitting assistance, any in-person meetings, town meetings that we can attend, again, depending on that scope. We can also help provide FEMA publications and other technical assistance. And then we, again, can assist with gathering the assessment data if possible or needed. I think we could also help with that quality control or going through and reviewing any assessments. And then establish the assessment prioritization areas, which is likely from FEMA or the community, since you know your community better than we do. So we do have limited access to insurance claim data. So FEMA, with their Privacy Act, really kind of locked down on giving out information like that. So again, in preparation, that you would have to enter an agreement with FEMA to get access to that data. So if that's something that you think you'll need, you might want to consider the ISAA, which I forget what the acronym is, but that's the agreement that you would need to go into FEMA for that. And then, of course, we can help train you or your team. Obviously we're in this course right now, but we also have the SDE course, but we can, show people how to use that. We do encourage written administrative procedures for disasters, and that way you just have a set of procedures that you can follow step by step as you work through the recovery process. Again, we can attend meetings and visit disaster areas for support or questions, and then we usually do a post-disaster CAV, or that would be the plan. Potentially, if you had a disaster, we would want to evaluate your permitting and procedures and determinations about a year after the event. So you definitely want to let people know that you have to do assessments, and that means in and outside of people's houses. And it may be confusing that I'm sorry. It may be confusing because there could be multiple groups that are doing assessments for different things. So emergency management is going to assess for different things because we're specifically assessing what the damage is and what the level is to the different characteristics of a structure. So that's why we have to go inside and outside. So making sure that you have identification on you that identifies you as a community official, and then doing this outreach so that people know you'll be specifically coming by for floodplain management substantial damage assessments. You can do a press release. You'll want to work with your public information officer if you have one, using social media to get that word out, making a media statement, and public meetings as well. So, first of all, you would be going around and just kind of doing a windshield inspection to determine which properties need to be looked at first and prioritizing those properties and getting them, in that order. Make sure the public information officer runs things by you for accuracy first. We don't want to have conflicting messaging from different community officials, which could cause misinformation or confusion. Um, you should probably do weekly briefings, go to council meetings, make sure that they know. So the emergency management will look for damage for presidential declaration. Um, And then you'll be out there doing assessments, and then insurance adjusters will be going around as well to do those assessments, although some of those have been switched to digital. Um, so again, there could be like 3 to 4 different entities going around doing assessments. So that's why we want to make sure people know why you're there in particular. So when you're doing the windshield inspection, as we call it, which is, you already have the scope, you know which structures have been impacted by the disaster. So you're going to go to those addresses and just make notes of which addresses have high damage, what you consider medium, or obviously low levels of damage. So take photos of that. Remember that streets could be blocked by debris, so you want to use this drive-by assessment to help determine which priorities need to be looked at again. So again, low, medium, high list of properties, and we're actually going to be going for the most medium ones first. So if it's medium damage, those are the ones that are going to be closest to the 50% threshold that we're looking at. And so high damage structures are not going to be able to be repaired right away because that would be extensive damage that's going to take some time. Whereas someone with medium damage might want to get started on that right away. And then low levels of damage, we're not too concerned with it. They do still have to go get permits, but we're not concerned about them building back without having elevated or something like that. Um, so that's why those are the first priority. And so that's just kind of explained here. Every damaged building has to be inspected, and we're prioritizing the mediums ones first that are closest to 50% or somewhere between 40 and 70 or 60. So we still have to inspect them and document that inspection and the level of damage that we determine. Right, okay. So for larger disasters, again, I know some people are very low on staff, but hopefully you would have a team of people. We can also be part of those teams. So ideally, we want to work in 2-person teams to do assessments, just so we have some oversight and comparison to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what we consider different levels of damage. And FEMA does have a field guide document that kind of tells you what to look for to help you categorize those levels of damage. And again, I'll go over that more in the next class, but Yeah, so working in teams, having oversight, comparison, you'll have someone back in the office that will do quality control on that stuff. Team meetings to decide which teams will inspect certain areas, so we don't want any overlap or any gaps in those properties. Um, so we're making sure we're covering all of that. Have the contact information for the floodplain administrator available for everyone. There are some areas you might have to get permission to enter, so that might be like a priority thing that you would do that once you've done your windshield inspection and you've prioritized all your properties and you have your team set up, making sure that you gain permission for certain types of entry. And then again, where identification for, to identify yourself as a city official, plan those routes. We need to have a working schedule. When do we expect to be done gathering data? And how long will it take to process the assessments? And then, of course, you can always ask for help. Um, FEMA may or may not get involved, especially at this point in time. They're very limited on what they can do, and they are many times just um, restricted by whether or not you have a declaration. So they can sometimes help. Um, So for the teams, they should be bringing a map with them, have their list of properties, make sure they're going to the right places, make sure that you document those addresses and take lots of pictures. And again, you don't want to have any overlap or any missing structures. So we are, again, interested in water lines, and I think that's important information for communities to have as well once they've experienced a flood. And so this is particular to flood, but we would document all the disasters. So that's the high water line. If you have one on a manufactured home like that, it's likely to be substantially damaged and probably unsafe to enter. They don't hold up as well to flooding and being inundated like that as much as other types of construction. So that's a tip, but you can always do the full inspection to make sure. Again, another water line. So we have a mud line on this high fence. Yep. And again, to document this. Um, so identifying which structures have been damaged could potentially be difficult. You can look at newspaper and media pictures to um, have that as a good source. You can look for piles of debris like carpet, insulation, sheetrock. People pulling that kind of stuff out of their house is usually a good sign. If there's construction dumpsters, um, yeah. So if people have all these possessions and other things like that outside, that's a good indication that they've incurred some kind of damage. So a lot of times people want to hold these because they need some of this evidence for their insurance adjuster. So that might be something that happens. But um, yeah, that's another part of it is that if they have flood insurance in the event of a flood, that they would have the inspector do that. So again, we need to act in a timely manner as much as possible. Um, because there have been cases in Kansas where people just kind of cleaned up and then immediately sold their house so they didn't have to go through the substantial damage improvements. And so basically, if it's damage to 50% or more of the market value um, to its pre-damage condition, then it has to come into compliance with the current regulations. And that oftentimes means that a structure has to be elevated so that the lowest floor is at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation or higher, depending on what you have adopted. And so if people try to get out of this and then a new property owner comes in and then they get hit with those consequences, it has happened before. We've seen people just paint over mold on the wall. We've seen communities not require residents to elevate structures, and then they got flooded and sued, and the city wound up having to pay for all of them to be elevated. So another unfortunate situation that you would not want to end up in. So we don't want to punish any new homeowners who didn't know because we don't have disclosure laws for flood damage in Kansas. So this happens quite a bit where the seller's not completely just like transparent with the buyers, so they'd have no idea that they're either located in a floodplain, would be required to have insurance, or if they're buying something that was substantially damaged but has not come into compliance yet, or whatever the case may be on that. So again, permits are required for all reconstruction and repair to flood damaged structures or any structure that's damaged in the floodplain by any cause. So a permit's required to repair even if it's just minor damage. So there is a difference between repair and cleanup. So if you have like an unfinished basement with some water in it, then um, you just kind of do some light cleaning and that is fine. Repair is what needs to be documented with the permit. And on our permit template, it does go over substantial damage and the percentage of damage that's being repaired. Um, and again, we will be probably conducting an audit about 1 year after the disaster to evaluate your recovery process and your permitting process and help you fix any deficits there. Maybe retroactive proofing, like retroactive permitting. We've had to do that a few times after a flood, and there have been substantially damaged buildings that had basements that were not required to be filled in and elevated. So that is a violation. Um, and if you start skipping one permit for one person, then everyone would want to skip their required permit. So you don't want to do that. Um, and then, of course, again, with the rumors and misinformation, people being told they don't need permits or something like that. So again, staying on the rumor mill, making people aware what the requirements are for permitting. So they need to know about that. So you can, utilize any like avenues that you have for doing that, like local media and all of that, as we went over. Um, so one of the other ways to avoid issues after flood is to make sure that you are already permitting new development in the floodplain, that you're already requiring that and doing the outreach. So when people are adding in patio slabs and fences and stuff like that, making sure that they're getting those permits so that they are well aware that they need floodplain development permits specifically um, for that repair and construction. So once emergency management has come through, it might be marked as dangerous and not you're not able to enter it. That's a very good sign that there is substantial damage. So we've seen quite a few like this, and then once we are able to inspect it, there is major damage that has made it unsafe for different reasons. So it could just be utility related, but it could also be that the foundation has become unstable or something like that. Um, so this is a tornado damaged home in Pawnee Rock back in 2017. Um, so this is like pretty much 100% damage. It's definitely substantially damaged, so you don't have to go through the entire substantial damage assessment if it's clearly, destroyed. So you just document that and, take lots of pictures so that you can, back that up. And then sometimes it looks like nothing is wrong with it. So this one is tagged for danger, but the damage is not apparent from the front. So what happened was there's a stream behind the structure, and basically after the flood, the back half of the foundation walls collapsed after it washed away the stability of the ground there. So they had a full basement, so the back half of the house is just kind of hanging over the air, and so that's why they got tagged. Um, so if you saw this and it's not apparent, you might rank them as low damage, but at least you know that you would still need to come back later and do the full assessment. And so, yeah. Yeah. So another case where substantial damage is obvious. So this manufactured home washed up against the tree line and then just broke in half. So you can just write 100% and there's no need to do the entire checklist. Just again, make sure you take pictures and you do still need to send the determination letter to them. So we need to determine what the floodplain status is. Is it in the floodway or the fringe? And then the extent of damage. So there's different ways to determine what the market value is. If you look in the substantial damage and improvement desk reference, they explain that in detail, how to do it. There's a couple of different ways, but as soon as you choose one, just pick one and stick with it and use it the same way for everybody, just so that you have equal treatment of everyone, so no one can complain that you were, I don't know, discriminating against them or something like that. Um, and then the cost of repairs and any other improvements to the pre-damaged condition. So this is pre-damaged. It's not the pristine condition. It's however it was before the disaster happened. And so you can require people to provide you with the cost of repairs from a licensed contractor or however you want to determine that. The desk reference does go over that stuff too. Um, and mold is always something to be aware of because it can damage a structure even further if not treated. And it can start growing within 48 to 72 hours after being exposed to the water. So you are likely to encounter it, so you want to be safe and maybe invest in some, I don't know if it's PPE, but like some masks, goggles, long pants and sleeves. Make sure you wash all that before um, as soon as you get home, and then protect yourself and your citizens. They may have questions about cleaning up mold. Um, so you want to go a couple of feet above the mold when you're cutting off the sheetrock because the water tends to climb up a bit higher than what you see from the outside. They do make moisture meters that you can buy that tell you basically when you're dry enough to start putting stuff back on, but it takes a while to actually fully dry out, and you want to make sure it's fully dry out so you don't have mold continuing to grow inside the walls. So yeah, this usually has to be torn out and replaced. Um, So again, non-substantially damaged, you still need a permit to comply with regulations, but it doesn't have to meet the substantial damage requirements. So there's no um, consideration as to whether it's elevated high enough. That would only be if it became substantially damaged. And so much like substantial improvement, we're typically looking at 1 year approximately. So if there was another disaster that happened like 6 months later, you would probably want to combine those two things. Um, so you do need the local permit to start repairs. Yeah. You can waive the permitting fees, but not the actual permitting requirement. If it's substantially damaged, yes, you do need the permit. Potentially, it could need a permit from the state if they were going to use fill, most likely. Um, the building protection requirements apply, so the as-built elevation certificate is needed. So basically, we need to know where the lowest floor is in comparison to your current base flood elevation, because that could have changed since it was built to make sure that it's high enough. So if it's already high enough, then there's no concern. They just get the permit and repair. If it's too low, they are required to elevate that. Um, and there are mitigation grants that could potentially help with that and other aspects of disaster, but we'll get around to that in a little bit. Yeah, preform structures are most at danger of being, built too low because they were built far before we had the risk information that we do now. So there's this group of building inspectors that can do some damage estimation. So they wait for CADEM and then they have that guidance. I have seen some people use these assessments and they're not thorough enough. They're not going inside. Um, so that's something to be aware of. We need to look at all the different elements that are listed in the substantial damage estimator tool. And the desk reference does tell you what all characteristics of the house need to be inspected and what can be excluded. So it's very detailed on that. Right. So yeah. Another thing about Hearts of America, if they have access to the flood maps and they do inspections, they sometimes add these blue placards that tell them that they need a permit and to contact the floodplain administrator, so that part's helpful. And this is what I was talking about, the desk reference. It's very detailed, and it goes over all the different aspects of doing assessments, determining market value, all of that. And then the SDE tool that FEMA has, it's a free software. And it has, again, that workbook and a field guide and lots of helpful information as well. And you can just download it online. Um, and then they do also have this kind of companion class that goes with it. So this is their independent study website. So you can go there and take a class on using the tool. And it's nice because they give you some practice data to work with and going through an assessment so that you have some hands-on experience with using it. So I found it very helpful. Um, I think it's like a 4-hour class, but that is available to you. And so again, what we're looking at is this formula. It's very simple, the cost to repair damage over the market value. And if that's equal to or greater than 50%, it's considered substantially damaged. So if you have a home that's valued at $95,000 and then it has a fire and it's going to cost $63,000 to bring it back to the pre-damage condition. So you just divide 63,000 by 95,000 and that's 0.66, so that's 66%, which is substantially damaged. And again, you just document that and people have an opportunity to appeal your decision if they can provide you with better information. So just a couple of examples of how to determine the market value. And it's only the structure, you exclude the land value. So we're just looking at the actual land value, or the actual structure value, and take out the land because that could definitely skew prices. But you can use tax assessment records, a bill of sale if it's been a recent sale, because we do take into account depreciation. An insurance settlement, although that's not always reliable if it's been underinsured or something. Um, and then an appraisal is a great way to do that. And it is something you could require people to get is to provide you with an appraisal. Um, yeah. So there are appraiser websites. Obviously, you can look up a lot of property information and then just keep this information updated. So a lot of it's just public, or the tax, that's also public. Everyone knows about it, and it's just a very simple way to determine the market value. And then again, they can come back if they disagree and provide you with a different number from a better source. Yep, it's usually public. Okay. So the cost of repairs would include materials used at the fair market value of those materials. Even if there are groups that donate materials, we still have to count them at their fair market value. Just like labor, even if there are volunteers, we still have to count it as if it was paid labor. Um, there's the Marshall and Swift residential guidebook that can help with that. Um, and then there are several things that getting excluded from the actual cost of repairs, such as debris removal and cleanup, any building plans, permit fees, and you can again find that full list in the desk reference. So we have to send a letter to owners of damaged structures. We give the percentage and we explain how we calculated it. So the SDE tool has a nice report that gets generated and it tells you all the different elements of the structure that you looked at and how much you gauged the damage to be. It should state what the source of the damage was, whether it was a fire or a widespread flood or whatever the case may be. Provide the code citation from your ordinance that talks about substantial damage and bringing things into compliance, the permitting requirements, how they can make an appointment to appeal your decision. You want to send that certified mail. And then, of course, we do have those template letters in our kit that I mentioned. So dispute resolution, again, after a disaster, everything's kind of emotional and people are experiencing loss and it's very expensive to have to elevate a house. And so there could be some disputes to your determination. So um, they can provide you with better cost of repair from an objective source. So it can't just be them because they're not objective. So we need a licensed contractor, a professional estimator, information from the insurance adjustment. There are disaster damage estimate groups, or the valuation. So they can also maybe provide you with a list of receipts and that kind of documentation. We just need something to back it up. Um, and if you're not comfortable, there have been cities that just have each person are required to give a contractor estimate from a licensed contractor, and you just compare it to the appraiser's market value, and then you have a simple way to do that um, and calculation. But yeah, again, pick one method and stick with it and use it for everybody. And I was going to mention there are sometimes contractors that try to scam people after a disaster with like discounted work and stuff. So that's something to be aware of. We kind of call them fly-by-night contractors. So if they're licensed in that area, then they should be good. So don't overlook utilities and mechanical equipment, the anchoring, flood vents, restricted use for enclosures. So sometimes people will convert an unfinished basement to a finished one. So that has to be taken into account. Crawl space construction and ductwork below the flooring. Um, so there's lots of different elements to look at. So you should have, again, maybe printed out for your pre-disaster kit, those checklists that have all those elements that need to be evaluated. And again, that's all listed in the SDE tool and the field guide workbook, those couple of publications. And then there's also a best practices document that's like 16 pages that just has tips on doing all that, the assessments. And if the property owner optionally does any additional improvements, that would have to be considered as part of the cost to repairs. So they may want to wait on doing that. And similarly, if they choose not to do all the repairs that would need to be done to get it to its pre-damaged condition, it doesn't matter. We still have to count them anyways. So that's something to be aware of. So if it's substantially damaged, we need to make sure that it's in compliance with our current code requirements. So the current ordinance and base flood elevation. It may already be in compliance and we just make that determination and issue the permit. So it's just a matter of looking at what the circumstances are for that particular structure. Um, Yeah. Okay. Wet floodproofing is an option for certain small, low-cost structures. So a shed. So if they put a shed on the floodplain, it should be, wet flood-proofed if it meets those requirements, which is just making sure it's equipped with flood openings, that it's properly anchored, and that it's used only for storage of materials. So Technical Bulletin 7 goes over when wet flood proofing can be used. So it's like if you have a single car garage and it's below the base flood elevation, we don't have to elevate it. We can probably just do a retrofit with flood openings. So we do have some of these smaller, low cost, low damage potential structures that have these exemptions under certain circumstances. Same thing here. A single car garage could be wet flood proofed. But we can't count the garage door as a flood opening. It would need the actual openings that work without any intervention. And then there's a lot of this documentation that you'll have organized by, well, they recommend geographically. So you have a property file for each of these properties, and then you maintain indefinitely the assessment, the permit that you issued, the determination that you made, any as-built certifications, the inventory of the structures and that supporting documentation, so the photographs, the um, determinations on each of those characteristics within the house and outside of it, any floodproofing certificates and maps and any appeal documents. So you need to keep all of that. Substantial damage is one of the hardest parts of the NFIP and floodplain management, and it can end up going to court. So as long as you maintain all of this documentation and it's defensible, you can provide that and justify your determination and that kind of thing. So people do have the right to appeal to you if they can provide better information, and you would just recalculate it. So here's an example of flooding that happened in Coffeyville back in 2007. Their levee was overtopped, and then a refinery ended up getting flooded, and then there was a large leak of oil into that water, and so a lot of homes were destroyed by that. And then the company had to buy them out, but that's just an example of another disaster that we had. Yeah, so again, post-flood situation, there are some flood-specific things, but again, substantial damage is, it's damage from any cause. So it could just be a windstorm, a tornado, an earthquake, or fire. Those structures still have to be, um, assessed if they're in the floodplain. And it's kind of hard to get people to understand why they have to elevate based on floodplain rules after they suffered a fire. So that's something to be aware of. If it's not flood related, people are more resistant to the requirements to meet the current floodplain regulations. So in this example, again, it's 100% damage. We don't need to do a full assessment because it's clearly destroyed. But you would keep this photo in your files and then have the date labeled on it. Yeah, it's best to put the timestamp, date that you can use from the camera on there. So back to the Chapman 2008 tornado. Um, a lot of the houses that were destroyed were in the floodplain. It followed the floodplain line pretty clearly. Um, so increased cost of compliance. This is something that people have on their NFIP policies. It's an extra $30,000 that they can get that will help them if they're substantially damaged to come into compliance with the regulations. So um, they have to file for that within 60 days after they get your assessment. So making sure people are aware of this if they have those policies, because they would be missing out on $30,000, which is not a lot in the scheme of things, but it does help, and it's something only NFIP policies have. So So the qualities of a good letter, cause of damage, stating the cause of damage, explain permitting requirements, the percentage, um, the substantial damage regulations if that applies, the local citation, the appeal process, the deadline, and your contact information. So we have all of those in our template letters. And here's an example of an ICC project. So they were flooded, and then they made the claim on their policy and the extra 30,000, and they built this crawl space, or I'm not sure how tall that is. It might be a diagram 7, but they put in an enclosure under their house, and then they finished that project. So it is much safer. So DRA 1206 is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act from 2018. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. Basically, it was a reform to the Stafford Act, and it amends sections 402 and 406. Um, so this is what we'll go over quickly. I know we're getting to the end here. The policy goals, the implementation timeline, and the overview. And there's resources online for, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and then what the eligibility and community requirements are. So it was considered by FEMA to be the most comprehensive emergency management reform since 2006. And basically, it increases mitigation funding and it incentivizes the disaster reduction investments. So it expands assistance for individuals and communities and advances FEMA's strategic goals. So basically, this is money that the community can be reimbursed for bringing people in, getting contractors, getting other communities or states to help them with the permitting and doing assessments and all the recovery activities. So floodplain administration and enforcement, including inspections, and then it pays for base and overtime wages for extra hires to facilitate the implementation and enforcement of adopted building codes. But you do have to make that claim within 180 days. And there has been some issues with getting a declaration within 6 months to be able to make this claim and get help with DRA 1206. There are efforts to expand that timeline, but as of now, it's still 180 days. But the goal is to increase the overall speed of recovery by bringing in these new resources that the community didn't have to be able to do all of these activities that you have to do for recovery. To enhance compliance with state and local building codes, as well as floodplain ordinances, by providing these additional resources. So this became effective in 2020. Again, funding is limited to 180 days after the disaster declaration. Did I put that right? Yeah. So FEMA will provide the resources to effectively do those things. The building code administration, code enforcement, floodplain management regulation and enforcement, and then substantial damage operations as well. So you can bring in contractors to help you with a lot of this stuff or other people that you need. So eligible work, the policy has that descriptive list in there. And if the work is eligible, if it's consistent with that list, then you can get reimbursed for it. It has to relate to repair, replacement, or retrofit of just disaster damaged structures, which could be private, public, or residential. No non-disaster development, and it's not to help update any ordinances or anything, but so it's the cost share for permanent work, budgeted employees and overtime for extra hires, purchase supplies and equipment for eligible work. And then the policy includes discussion of direct assistance through FEMA's risk management division. And that section does not apply to public assistance. So you submit your application for reimbursement, and then you have to save and turn in all of the documentation for completed work, what those costs were, where it was located, and the EMAC, which is the National Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So they use those resources or any other interstate or interlocal mutual aid agreements that you might have. So they used this in the Tennessee Waverly flood that they had. And one of our FEMA regional staff actually was the floodplain administrator for this incident, but they were able to use the DRA 1206 funds to be able to hire part-time employees to assist with the substantial damage determination letters. And they had to do 272 determinations. So if you think about it like that, you might need extra help. Um, so this is what they do, the benefits of it, hire and train staff, review applications for building permits. Again, you can get contracted services, information to staff, coordinate administration and enforcement with your regulations, doing the assessments, investigating structures under construction for compliance with applicable codes, laws, and ordinances, and investigate complaints. So there's a lot that can be done with this funding. Um, the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, FEMA put this out January 6th of this year, so this has been updated. It's called the Papa G, and it goes over all the different categories and of work that you can do. And then there's these additional resources if you just search for these online. The 1206 policy, they have frequently asked questions, volumes 1 and 2, and then they also have a public assistance companion guide. Just the last couple of slides here, I mentioned rumor control and getting the outreach out there to make sure that people are getting accurate answers. And again, people will want to start rebuilding the morning after a disaster, and they're not going to wait for your damage assessments to be complete or apply for permits in many cases. So this results in non-compliant structure and why the timeline is so important when you get started post-disaster. Like the morning after, you can hear construction and cleaning, and they don't want to wait. So FEMA doesn't give a pass to people who build without a permit, so we have to enforce the regulations. And that's about it. That's our site. You can always find us if you just type in like Kansas floodplain, that should pull it up, and we have all of our maps and things available online. So yeah. And that's our contact information. And wow, it's just now 11 o'clock. So we don't have any poll questions. We just have one about if you want a certificate or not. I will stop sharing and Caitlin can launch that. And then I'll see if there's been any questions. Let's see. I mean, so here's the question. Have federal cutbacks affected FEMA assistance such as Stafford Act? I think so. Obviously they've had a lot of people get let go, so they don't have as much staff, and it was already taking them quite a long time to get mitigation funding and stuff like that to communities. So I would definitely think this would impact any future disasters requests for 1206 or anything like that. And the governor has to make a request for a declaration, and so it kind of depends on them whether or not, the administration, whether or not a disaster gets approved for um, that declaration that opens up a lot of these resources. So I would expect definitely delays and cutbacks in availability or denials for that stuff. So. Yes, so I will send out a follow-up email that has a post-training survey and then these slides and some of those resources. And then I'll also get out your certificate sometime, hopefully this week, if you want a certificate. Does anyone else have any other questions? You can come off mute if you want to ask anything. All right. Well, if there's no questions, don't hesitate to reach out if you ever do have any. But yeah, we appreciate you spending the hour with us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.